This island of Milos lies about 100 kilometers north of Crete, a relatively small island whose northern coast is wrapped around Milos Bay, once a huge volcanic crater, but now one of the best harbors in the Aegean. Most of the 5,000 people of Milos, the Melians, live either at the port of Adamas or in the cluster of whitewashed houses of the village of Plaka that crawl up the lower slopes of the Casta mountain. It's a conical peak with a small, neat chapel perched right on the top. The rest of the Melians are scattered in small villages or live on farmsteads throughout the island, working their parched brown fields of tomatoes, watermelons, corn, beans, olives. But more modern signs of industry are the great white scars cut into the hillsides where bulldozers and mechanical shovels grab lorries full of white pumice from the quarries to be shipped from the port to the mainland of Greece. And oddly enough, 9,000 years ago, prehistoric man might have been said to be doing much the same sort of thing on this island of Milos, with a material called obsidian. Obsidian is a jet black stone with just the same character as flint, and this is found in great quantity in Milos. Now, prehistoric man found it, and he chipped it into arrowheads, spearheads, scrapers, and knives. Now, we know that somehow this obsidian from Milos was taken to mainland Greece in 7000 BC, the very first trace we have of trade or exchange between peoples in Europe. Now, Robin Torrance of the Department of Prehistory and Archaeology at Sheffield University is sometimes to be found in the obsidian fields of Milos, carefully counting and examining the mass of black chippings that completely cover the ground, each and every chip being the unacceptable and discarded waste of a prehistoric human being.
You can imagine what it was probably like here. People would beach their boats near the bottom of the source, as it's right on the sea, crawl up the cliffs, and probably dig for a morning or an afternoon. A few people coming from all over the island, and from all over Greece, in fact. It does not appear that the quarry was owned by anyone. Anyone could come, and they would dig a hole and dig out the pieces that they wanted, and sit right down and have a bash at it, see which were the good pieces, and make them into the tools which they then carried away. We can tell this because the greatest density of working material occurs right next to the source areas and tapers out fairly quickly away from these areas. Within the site, there is a little bit of variability in the kinds of objects people were making, but very little that we can see. This year, most of our work is not here at Stanikia, but is in the laboratory in Plaka, where I've been looking at the material very carefully, counting each piece which we collected from the field, measuring it and weighing it in order to verify my initial observations from the field work at the site. No quarry in the world has ever been studied systematically, and we're hoping my efforts along this line will show us the way that one needs to look very carefully at rather boring material in order to find out exactly what was happening. And also, we're hoping that the study of the quarry will give us a better idea of how some of the earliest trade in the Aegean and throughout the world was carried on.
Robin Torrance there is just one of a team of archaeologists and specialists who are working on the island this summer under the direction of Colin Renfrew, Professor of Archaeology at the University of Southampton.
Well, we are here because we have, for the past 4 years, been researching into the archaeology and in particular into the prehistory of this island and trying to learn something about the origins of Aegean civilization and in particular into the origins of civilization in Milos. The reason for choosing this island is that, first of all, there is a very important prehistoric site here which we've been excavating. Secondly, it was the home of one of the early Greek city-states around 600 BC, and most particularly that it is an island, quite a small island, no more than 20 kilometers long, 10 kilometers wide, and yet this very small island must have provided the subsistence basis for this early civilization. And our approach has deliberately been an interdisciplinary one. We have geologists with us, we have had geomorphologists working here, and a geographer, and naturally we've been excavating and following a number of archaeological approaches. And the overall orientation of the project has been an environmental one to try and understand prehistoric Milos and ancient Milos, that is classical Milos, in its overall environmental context.
Another archaeologist working on the project is John Cherry, also from Southampton. He's directing an intensive site survey of the island, a detailed examination of a selected sample of the landscape, to identify every sign that still remains of man's presence down the ages. A formidable task, but to do this, the island was divided into kilometre grid squares. And last year, a team of students under John Cherry's direction walked and scoured every centimetre of the ground in linear strips of 1 kilometre wide, right across the island. These linear strips were separated every 5 kilometres, and in this way, 1/5 of the island was examined in close detail and recorded. John Cherry is back this year to finish off the study and to begin considering some of the results.
The number of sites that were known before we began our survey was something in the region of 40 or 45. We can now say that there are about 105 or 110 sites known in Milos. Now, of course, this refers only to sites that were known previously, and this survey of a further 1/5 of the island. We've found further evidence of very early settlement on Milos, dating to the Neolithic period. Sites of the Neolithic in the Cyclades are really very rare. There's only a handful known, 5 or 6 perhaps. One of these was reported on Milos before we began our survey. But we can now say that we know of at least half a dozen, and the assumption must be that there are more to be found.
The traces of man's occupation and activity of these very early settlements of around 7,000 BC are by no means obvious or easy to discover amongst the grass and scrub and stones of this very hilly landscape.
On none of these sites is there any pottery, which I find very interesting. The kinds of artifacts we find on such sites are tools and waste chips of obsidian, but we find no walls, no pottery, nothing that indicates really permanent settlement of any kind. So the finding of sites a little later than 7,000 BC, these sites probably date to the 4th millennium, I should think, indicates that interest is rising in Milos. We have a number of sites scattered widely throughout the island, not just in the vicinity of the main obsidian outcrops that we see today, but all over the island. Then, in the later period, in the 3rd millennium BC, we begin to pick up in our site survey a number of really very modest sites, small scatters of handmade pottery, not very spectacular, not decorated, often very eroded, certainly difficult to recognize, associated with more obsidian tools, arrowheads, knives, waste materials, cores, this kind of thing. And this is an indication, we think, of the first really permanent settlement on Milos. Small-scale settlements, probably no more than a farm, perhaps a hamlet, certainly nothing resembling a village, let alone a town. But by about 2000 BC, we find a strange thing in the survey. We begin to find it very difficult to find sites bearing the pottery that we know was made on Milos at this time. We know that it was made on Milos because we find it in the main site at Philakopi, which is now under excavation. But out in our survey, we found it very difficult to find any. And throughout the 2nd millennium, pottery and indeed settlements of this period are very scarce indeed. So this is some indication that we have a centralization movement going on, a moving into a central place, as it were, a main polity.
And this ancient city, called Philakopi, was built on the shore of the north coast, looking out across the Aegean to Sparta and the Greek mainland, the first really large town to be built in the island by Neolithic people who, for some reason or another, chose to give up their remote farmsteads and live together as a town community. But John Cherry's story doesn't end with the rise and fall of Philakopi.
After the end of the settlement of Philakopi, it's difficult to know what goes on. There's a dark age where it's very difficult to recognize pottery or artifacts of any kind. But early in the 1st millennium, we again begin to pick up very small-scale settlements, widely scattered throughout the island in different ecological zones. And again, these are small settlements, quite modest in scale. And we see these as related to the main polis of ancient Milos, classical Milos.
An entirely different town of the great classical Greek tradition, where the road to the Greek theatre was once lined with beautiful statues, amongst them the Venus de Milo, exiled now to the dark basement of the Louvre in Paris. But the theatre is still there, and the great stadium, and many remains of what was once a fair-sized and thriving town overlooking the great bay of Milos, visited, it seems, by writers and poets of the time.
We know, of course, from Thucydides that this city was sacked in 416 BC by the Athenians. And again, interestingly, in the survey, in the century following that, we find a marked decline in the number of settlements throughout the island. But in the early Roman period, we see them taking off again, increasing in number and in size and in scope. And in the later Roman period, between perhaps the 3rd and 5th centuries after Christ, we see the highest density of settlements ever known in Milos, perhaps even greater than today. And interestingly, we find that a number of these settlements are associated with various kinds of industrial activities, pottery making of various kinds, the mining of sulfur, and certainly of the various volcanic minerals that abound in the island of Milos.
And so from the detailed survey of 1/5 of the landscape, we get a picture of repeated changes from the widely scattered Neolithic people deciding to live together in the large settlement, the city of Philocopie, then another phase where the people give up town life to become scattered farming folk again, and then a revival of Philocopie in the 1300s BC. Collapse again, and an entirely new town of classical Greek character built by the harbour, which has its day and is then destroyed. The city of Philocopie is now under close scrutiny as this year's excavation progresses under John Younger of Duke University, North Carolina, and Colin Renfrew, directing operations on behalf of the British School of Archaeology in Athens.
Now, what we are doing this year, this is the 4th year of our excavations, is finishing the work in a very exciting building which we found, which is a Mycenaean shrine. It dates from around 1300 BC, and 3 years ago, when we first dug here, we came down on what seemed a very modest little room, and we began to find 1 or 2 little Mycenaean figurines made of baked clay of terracotta, 2 or 3 inches high, and then a conch shell, then some fragments of ostrich egg shell, and then a rather curious pottery vessel, and then a very small gold head, about 2 inches high, of gold leaf, and a number of very beautifully worked seal stones, and nearby a couple of bronze figures were found. So that it's very clear that we have a religious building, which is quite reasonable to call a shrine. But then last year, to our surprise, we found that there is also a west shrine, which is a big square room, and in that we found a series of very curious male figurines with the arms outstretched forwards, which are something that simply have not been found before on Mycenaean sites. And so our aim this year is to finish excavating this very important shrine building, of which there are very few known at all from the Mycenaean world.